appreciate you coming, taking time out of your life to be here with us. We've still got people popping in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Margaret Newman. I'm the Executive Director of Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group, and we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and restoring wild salmonid populations and their habitats through restoration, protection, education, and community involvement throughout our region of Central and South Central Washington. We have a few of our board members here tonight and several staff people. You can see Katrina Strathman because she has her camera on. If anybody else wants to turn their cameras on and say hi. One of the only good things about Zoom and digital meetings is we can bring people together from a large area. We're super excited to bring you this presentation tonight. We've got two speakers, and our overall theme is fire in our backyard, impacts to forests and fish. And so it's my really big honor to get to introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Megan Walsh, and she's a professor in the Department of Geography and the co-director of the Cultural and Environmental Resource Management Program at Central Washington University. Dr. Walsh is a biographer and paleoecologist studying the role of fire on the landscape. She uses high-resolution macroscopic charcoal and pollen analysis to reconstruct past changes in fire activity, vegetation changes, and climate variability to evaluate past and present human and environmental relationships. Dr. Walsh studies sediment cores from lakes and wetlands and has ongoing research in the Eastern Cascades, the Olympic Peninsula, Mount Rainier, the Willamette Valley, the Western Cascades of Oregon, and Belize. And then we also have JD Jones here. JD is the Fisheries Program Manager for the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. And since oh boy, I'm living in the past. Since 2016, how old are you, JD? Since 2016, JD has served as a Forest Burned Area Emergency Response Coordinator. He has worked on about 25 burned area emergency response teams throughout the region. JD has worked on forests on the east and west sides of the Cascades, including the Fremont, Winnema, the Malheur, Mount Baker, Snoqualmie, and Colville. JD's talk tonight will be geared towards how the Forest Service deals with post-fire response, specifically the protection of fish and natural resources. JD strives to help the forest ecosystem sustain its health, diversity, and productivity to meet the needs of future and present generations. So just before we start, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end. You can also put your questions in the chat box at any point, and we'll keep you muted or keep yourselves muted during the presentation, and then at the end you can unmute. We can unmute you, but you may also need to unmute yourself. And if you called in on the phone, just mute yourself on your phone. And then just like Zoom, you can change the view from everyone to just who's talking, which is nice for the presentations. On my screen, this option is at the top center. Also, if the slides look too small to you, there's a little plus sign, you can enlarge them. We have 2 more talks in our winter speaker series. I hope you'll join us for those. In 2 weeks, Alex Conley, Making Sense of the Numbers, Fish Population Trends in the Mid-Columbia and Beyond. And then a month from today, Kat Strathman, who's here, we'll be talking about cottonwood establishment in the Yakima Basin and what we are learning for fish. So those should be great. We're super glad you're here. We will be recording tonight. And I think with that, we're ready to get started. And Megan is our first speaker.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Looks great.
And hear me? Yes. Okay. Good.
Sound good. Thanks so much.
Now I just got to figure out where to put you guys that I can see my screen. How do I make it small? let's see, collapse. There we go. All right, that's a little better. Okay, welcome. I'm not going to introduce myself since we've already done that, but I love talking about fire. My students will tell you any day I get to talk about fire in class, I am a happy camper. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about past trends in fire activity in the Eastern Cascades and a little bit about where we're going. But I think you'll be able to see pretty clearly from a lot of these things that I will be showing you that we're kind of on this trajectory toward more fire in the future. So it's funny, in the 25 years I've been teaching and researching fire, teaching about it, it's become more and more clear why studying fire on the landscape is necessary. I don't really have to give the explanation that I used to have to give, right? 15 years ago, we all know we have really bad fire years here in the Pacific Northwest, like 2020. And we know that this has a lot to do with the climate that we're experiencing, right? With warmer summers, drier forests, lower humidities, all these kinds of things lead to these high fire years that we're getting used to at this point experiencing. When I came to Central Washington, when I started in the geography department here, it was kind of nice. There was no one here at my university studying this. Certainly people out in the Forest Service and other places had been studying fire activity, but not doing exactly what I do and what I'll talk to you about today. But it was kind of nice. I mean, I hate to say it's nice that fires happen, but kind of nice when the big fires like the Taylor Bridge fire and the Table Mountain fires happened back in 2012. I had this living laboratory I could take my students to. I take field trips to these all the time. I've watched the landscape kind of come back after these fires. They're very different from each other. And again, just really kind of points out the need to understand where we've come from with fire activity in our forests and where we're going in the future. And these certainly have continued, right, on through the Jolly Mountain fire in Cle Elum in 2017, the Evans Creek fire in 2020 near Ellensburg. I could add the Schneider Springs fire to this that happened between here and Yakima last year. So again, it's just, you know, we're seeing more and more fire on the landscape, and I think it's hard through all of this that we see, right, the evacuations, the homes burning down, lives lost, that it's hard to remember that fire is actually good, right? That fire has this impact on the landscape that's often beneficial, right? We have some forests that really need it to clear the understory, like you can see here, and I'll talk more about that as I go through. It promotes habitat for things like bobcats and birds and woodpeckers and all sorts of other organisms. It increases germination of certain plants, like you can see here with the bear grass. So it is hard through all of the media attention and the smoke that we're all choking on during the summertime to remember that there are these really beneficial sides of fire, and that really our forests are fire adapted, right? We have these trees, these plants that respond positively to fire. And so, you know, the question then kind of becomes, how do we fix this fire situation that we're in today? So I'm going to talk mostly about studying fire history, reconstructing long-term fire histories. But I like to start with this and just kind of start with these ideas about what does it mean to study fire history? I don't just study fire, right? Because fire touches so many other elements of our life, touches so many other kind of areas of study. So to study fire history also means to study climate history, right? It means to study past climatic trends, warmer periods, colder periods, periods with more or less precipitation, influence of things like ice sheets here in the Pacific Northwest, changes in insolation, which is what's represented by this somewhat complicated graph. But I like to post it here as kind of this idea that we're constantly living through changes in our climate and our associated weather that goes with that. So I get to be a bit of a climatologist as well. Studying fire also means studying vegetation, and I'm a paleoecologist. I love studying forests and plants, and certainly they are responding to fires as they happen. We get these successional processes, we get these disturbances that come along that start over our forests, make them more healthy in many situations. So I certainly get to do a lot with vegetation. But maybe my favorite part is that I also get to study human history when I study fire history, because humans have been here in the Pacific Northwest for at least the last 15,000 years. We're now maybe even pushing those dates back farther. And certainly Native Americans were using fire on the landscape as really their most important tool to be able to harvest resources, do a lot of other things. And so I love it that I get to kind of combine all of these things to make sense of the fire records that I'm going to show you today. And it is this indigenous use of fire that really, I think, is probably the most important component of it, because again, humans have been living here. We know that they've been using fire for many different reasons, whether it was to increase the yield of huckleberry bushes, whether it was to maintain camas fields, whether it was to clear trails, or a list of 30, 40 other reasons. We know that this is part of our landscape legacy, and it's been removed today, and I'm going to show you really the results of that and how we move forward. So history matters, right? I'm talking about fire history, and there's only so many ways we can go about reconstructing what past fire activity has done. Certainly we can look to maps and human kept records from like the Forest Service or other land management agencies. And these are useful. They're often pretty good at telling us where fires happened and when they happened, but they only go so far back in time, maybe the last 100, 120 years if we're lucky. The next tool we can use is looking at fire scars that develop on trees that don't completely burn down during a fire, but are scarred by them. And those are these black lines that you're seeing here on this ponderosa pine. And I'll come back to this ponderosa pine when I get to one of my sites that I'll talk about. Really great tool, tell us exactly when a fire happened, because you can count the annual rings, tell us exactly where a fire happened, can even, tell us the spatial extent, but again, can only get us back about maybe 500 years if we're lucky in the Pacific Northwest. So that leaves us then with charcoal, which is basically the incompletely combusted pieces of vegetation that come from wildfires that accumulate in lake and bog and other wetland sediments. So this is what I do, and this is probably the most fun part of my job, except for being in the classroom every day with students. Go out to different lakes and water bodies, and the idea is that when a fire happens on the landscape, all of that charcoal is going to either fall onto the top of the lake or wash in there, and it's going to essentially sink its way down through the water column and build up these layers within the sediment that's accumulating at the bottom of any water body that's basically had water in it for a long period of time, as long as that hasn't really dried out or something hasn't come along and messed with the sediment at the bottom. So we come along and take these vertical tubes of mud down through those sediment, through that sediment that's accumulated with a rig that looks like this. This is 2 cataract pontoons, a metal cataract frame with some wood decking over the top. We've got ourselves anchored down in this lake here, which is up in Mount Rainier National Park. There's a hole in the middle of the deck behind that red bag. We basically are extending our coring devices down through this PVC tube that we've extended from the raft to where the mud starts. And we use really simple tools. We use what's called a Livingston piston corer. And it works in the same way that basically if you take your straw, right, and you stick it down into your soda and you cap it with your thumb, you can pull it back out and that liquid stays within the straw. That's essentially the same things that's happening with this little piston that slides up the core as you push it down into the mud. This is all hand operated, all hand powered. Take a bunch of students out in the field with me. It's really fun. You get to hang out on lakes. And basically we're coring from the top of the mud until bedrock. Hopefully, if we can get that far. We take both what are called short cores, which you can see over here on the right-hand side. This is the water that's at the top of, that's basically where the water meets the mud, so the sediment water interface. And so we take the short core. You can see there's that ash layer right here from Mount St. Helens about 500 years ago. And then we use that Livingston device I showed you on the last page to basically just meter by meter by meter by meter extract the mud that's accumulated at the bottom of these lakes. And you can see that we come across things that sometimes we can get through, sometimes we can't, like this tephra layer that you can see here. This is from Mount Mazama, the Crater Lake eruption that happened about 7,600 years ago. So again, probably the best part of my job, hanging out on lakes in the summer and getting these sediment cores. And then the hard work begins. We take them back to the lab. We start slicing them up at very thin intervals, either centimeters or half centimeters, which is what my grad student Tammy here is doing. And then sampling them in constant volumes for charcoal, and then essentially counting all of the charcoal particles that we come across within those samples to get these records that I'm going to show you here in a minute. This is not rocket science. This is not, you know, big fancy equipment. This is us just basically taking little syringefuls of mud, washing it through these sediment sieves to get the larger particles, what's called macroscopic charcoal, not microscopic, because it's those larger pieces of charcoal that don't come from as far. If you look at the teeny tiny pieces, you can get fires from thousands of miles away. We want to reconstruct what's going on in the local area around that lake, so we use these bigger particles. They then get washed into petri dishes and counted underneath a stereoscope, and this is something that I train graduates and undergraduate students to do. One of the big things we're looking for when we look at the charcoal itself is what kind of charcoal it is, and oftentimes it's just a simple designation between what looks like woody charcoal, right? Looks like something that's in your fireplace or your fire pit outside, versus herbaceous charcoal. Hopefully you can see in enough detail here, right, that these are more flat. They're basically 2D instead of 3D, and they have these holes in them, and the holes are the stomata of essentially herbaceous plants, right? Anything that has a photosynthetic stem to it, you get these holes in it, right? The stomata are opening and closing as the plant is photosynthesizing, right? So just by keeping kind of track of how much woody charcoal there is versus how much herbaceous charcoal there is, we can get an idea of not only how often fires have been burning on the landscape, but also what kind of fires they are, right? What are the fuels that are burning within those fires? So the other big thing that we do along with this is palinology, or using pollen, right, which is the male gametophyte of seed plants, to understand how vegetation has changed through time, right? Because it doesn't do us much good to look at the charcoal record if we don't also look at the pollen record to know what kind of vegetation was burning. And so you can see some beautiful pollen grains down here. I love counting pollen. It's taken many years for me to learn it and be good at it. I have taught a few of my graduate students to do this, but this is mostly something I contribute to the research that we do. But you can see this is an alder pollen and a hazelnut pollen and a pine pollen over there. So it's unique to the plant it comes from. It's not always unique to the species level, but oftentimes to the genus level and very infrequently to the family level. And then the last thing we have to do is radiocarbon date our cores, or basically give our sediment cores a chronology, right? You can see that here, this is an example from Battleground Lake, which was part of my dissertation. This was a core that was over 8 meters long. And all of these little black kind of squiggly marks that you're seeing here are radiocarbon dates. And it basically allows us to, through the process of radiocarbon dating, right, finding something that has carbon in it, sending it off to a lab, they give us back an age. And then we can attach ages with the different depths down through the core. And then we oftentimes use lead-210 dating at the top, which has a much shorter half-life and gets at the recent period that radiocarbon dating isn't useful for, right? Kind of a fun cross-section between my work, paleoecology here in the geography department, but also with, geography with the geology. It are these tephra layers that we find, right? We find these big, beautiful tephra layers like this one you can see here from Mount St. Helens, this really chunky one that you can see from Mount Rainier. This was Sunrise Lake up at Mount Rainier. So no wonder we're getting, you know, big pumice bombs, big chunks of tephra that absolutely beat up my equipment. They were so hard to get through. I had to get new coring equipment the second year we went back. But if you know what these are, if you can have someone like I did, I went down to the Cascades Volcano Observatory and had someone down there help me identify them. If they're dated well, then they're free dates for your core, because radiocarbon dating is very expensive. Okay, so let me take you to the Eastern Cascades and talk about my case studies. Again, you guys are kind of trying to figure out a good place to put. There we go. Okay, I hid you. Okay. I know there's a lot on the screen. Let me kind of explain it and break it down here. Back in 2015, I put together this publication that is essentially 34 records from the Pacific Northwest. All these dots that you see over here on this map, all the green and black dots, all the macroscopic charcoal records that we had from the Pacific Northwest. So really just pay attention to this red line here. Here's 12,000 years ago down here, and here's present over here on the right. And so what it is just a combination of all of these different macroscopic charcoal records together with each other. They've been standardized, changed into Z-scores, and then basically we get this overall pattern of what fire activity has done in the Pacific Northwest at all 34 of these sites combined over the past 12,000 years. And the really interesting thing to see on this, oh, I'm gonna pop up. Oh, my animation, oh, am I frozen? Hold on. Okay, there we go. Didn't like what I did. Is this increase in fire activity that's come during the last 5,000, 5,500 years, where really the climate in the Pacific Northwest has only gotten cooler and wetter, but yet fire activity has increased, and this has a lot to do with basically forests coming in and more biomass to burn. But I also hypothesize that it has a lot to do with increased climate variability throughout this time period, which is what's represented by these El Nino Southern Oscillation events down here, but also with increased human use of fire during this time as human populations grew during the middle to late Holocene. All right, so what became clear out of this research when I put this together was the clear lack of paleoecology sites over here in the Eastern Cascades. This is Fish Lake, which is my site. This is Five Lakes. It's not my site, but it's a very short record. And then there's these 2 records up here in British Columbia. But basically that was it. 30 of the sites were on the west side of the Cascades and 4 in this analysis were on the east side. So since that time, I've come in with my students, my grad students, and gone out and we've added all of these different sites here that you see. And I'm going to focus on these ones here in the Eastern Cascades, especially up here in this area. I'm going to start out up here in the Sinlahican wildlife area, talking about Fish Lake and Doheny Lake. But then I'm also going to skip down here to Long Lake toward the end and show you just kind of the variability in our fire history in the Eastern Cascades. And I'm not saying this is the end all be all. We are constantly adding sites, more data points, but this is at least a lot better than where we were in 2015. Okay, so if you haven't been to the Sinlahican, I love this place. I highly recommend you go. Dale Swedberg, who was the manager of the Sinlahican Wildlife Area for, I want to say 15 or 20 years, is now retired, but back in 2011, asked me if I would come up and try to work up a long-term fire history from this region. They had done a lot. Here's that same Ponderosa pine I showed you earlier. They had done a lot of research gathering all of the fire scars from this area, but they wanted a longer, a longer range, a longer picture of what fire activity had done in the Sinlahican, and really to use it for, I guess justifying, maybe that's not the right word, but really proving that it's necessary to thin these forests to treat them with prescribed fire. And in fact, that's what they're doing up in this area. So I started with Fish Lake. If you've been to the Sinlahican, you've driven by Fish Lake. It's this nice big glacially carved lake. The Okanagan lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet did this, or the Laurentide ice sheet. It's probably much older than what I have from it. I have about 4,000 years of a record from it. It's probably about 12,000 years old, but it's very deep and hard to get mud out of. It's a beautiful area. I guess I should mention it's the oldest wildlife area in the state of Washington, and so it's special for a lot of ways, in a lot of ways. So let me skip to the fire history record, and again, I'll kind of show you how to look at this. You can pick the age scale you prefer to look at, whether that's cal years BP, so calendar years before present, or an AD BC scale down here, but basically this record is about 3,800 years old. All of the squiggles that you're seeing down here is the charcoal that was counted from this record by my student Haley. The black is the total charcoal. The green overlay that you're seeing is the herbaceous charcoal. And hang on, I'll come back to that. Let me tell you what the other lines are. The brown line up here is basically an index of the pollen. I'm not going to show you any pollen diagrams. I can show you them if you have a question about them or want me to email them to you, but basically the pollen didn't change at this site over the last 3,800 years. It stayed a ponderosa pine, kind of sagebrush steppe environment. It only started to change really during the last couple hundred years over here. The purple line on here is a composite population index. So coming from archaeological records, kind of a proxy for human population on the Columbia Plateau. And so what you see in this record is there's a ton of charcoal. And it basically doesn't stop, right? It just kind of keeps going. There's no breaks between it. There's a lot of it. It ramps up during the medieval climate anomaly, which is what MCA is, and even throughout the Little Ice Age, increasing fire. And then as the population crashes, so does the fire activity. But it's the high amount of herbaceous charcoal in this record, again, that green that you're seeing, which was about 80%. It was the highest amount of herbaceous charcoal I'd ever counted, or my student counted. And it really signifies that these were low severity, very frequent understory fires happening that were clearing out the landscape, but not burning down the forest, because if it was burning down the forest, we would have seen that in the pollen. Let me zoom in on the top part of the record. Again, pick your age scale you'd prefer to look at here, but older on the left, over here, present on the right. And you can see the massive drop in fire activity that comes along with basically settlement, right? Euro-American settlement in the Fish Lake area happened at this time. Oh, wrong way. There we go. For reference, in 1883 is when Chief Sarsapkin and his family were given allotments in the Sinlahican Valley. Many Native Americans lived here, the Sinkaitek tribes, lots of others, again, who were likely, you know, I can't tell you, I get this question all the time. Can you tell whether a fire that was lit by humans or whether it was lit by lightning? No, I can't do that, but I think we can pretty clearly say that this frequent of fire was at least being aided by human use of fire. And then again, as Euro-American settlement came through, as disease wiped out many Native Americans, that fire activity. Fire activity stopped.
Uh-oh.
Somebody's excited to see their daddy. Okay, that fire activity stopped, and it really hasn't returned. A small fire in 1977, but then a massive fire of the 2015 Carlton Complex fires came through this area and burned it. So what has this done? What has this removal of fire from the landscape done? Well, luckily, Japanese photographer named Frank Matsuura came through this region in the early 1900s. This is a picture of Fish Lake looking east. And Dale Swedberg, again, the former manager of the Sinlahican, went back out and did repeat photography in many of the places where Frank took pictures. What you should zero in on over here is just the amount of tree growth, right? The amount of how much more vegetation there is on this hill slope, pretty open and bare there, and very much filled in here. Mainly ponderosa pines growing back here. Still some ponderosas today, but much of this region on this hill slope has been filled in with Douglas fir and even grand fir, which are much more moisture-loving trees, shade-tolerant trees. And it's not just this one place in the Sinlahican. Again, Dale did an amazing job of tracking down all of these photo points where Frank took these pictures. And so you can see a very open landscape here in the Sinlahican, and then very much more crowded in by trees. And this is the effect. This is the loss of fire on the landscape. And this is what Dale realized, and why thinning and prescribed burning is part of the solution here. And again, much of this burned in 2015. So let me just scoot a little bit south of here. So we were talking about Fish Lake, which is here. Doheny Lake, which is just a couple miles away as the crow flies, actually kilometers away as the crow flies, has a much longer record from it. I was able to get a 12,000 year long record out of this lake. And now I have these two kind of next to each other for comparison. Sorry, just one age scale here of calendar years before present. So here's present over here on the right. And then I've also put in here that summary of those 34 that biomass burning record, this charcoal curve from those 34 records that I showed you back from that 2015 publication. So again, what you should see is that there's a lot of fire over the last 12,000 years, right? Lots of little fires really back during this period. The pollen record shows that it was a pine dominated parkland, probably a very open landscape, sagebrush steppe, something like that. And then as the forest fills in, as it becomes ponderosa pine forest with Douglas fir, maybe some larch, we get bigger kind of glugs of charcoal coming in. Granted, the resolution is a little bit lower in the record here, but very constant fire on the landscape. And in fact, I can't even really resolve these records to tell you how often those fires are, but both of these records match up very well with what we know from tree rings, from fire scars from tree rings, that fires, at least kind of at the right before settlement, were happening every maybe 3 to 7 years, maybe even up to maybe 15 years between fires, but very frequently. But again, low severity fires, not necessarily burning down the forest. And again, we can tell that by the high green, right? The high amount of herbaceous charcoal in these records. All right, so I'm going to come back to the tops of the records here. Let's skip down here for a second. I'm going to add in Long Lake, which is my most southern lake that I have, which is just west of Yakima, actually west of Natchez. You can see it on the map here in the little red box. I'm also going to talk about Sunrise Lake, which is up in Mount Rainier National Park, and then Fish Lake again, which is up here in the Sinlaheecon. So if we just compare the last 2,000 years at all three of these sites, again, President is over here on the right, you can see that these very different forests, right? This is a subalpine fir-dominated forest up at Mount Rainier, so high elevation, a grand fir mixed forest here at Long Lake, middle elevation, and again, back to Fish Lake, that's ponderosa pine forest, sagebrush steppe, very low elevation. What you should get out of this is that all of our forests here really have a very different fire regime, right? Historical fire regime, what's happened in the past. Very infrequent fires happening up at Mount Rainier, much more frequent fires, and in fact, I can calculate, at Mount Rainier, it's about 300 to 400 years in between big stand replacing fire events when they come along. Long Lake, mixed fire regime, some smaller fires, some stand replacing fires, about every 80 years is what I'm able to calculate here. And then again, too frequent to calculate down here, but probably every 3 to 7 years or so. Look at the top part of the record though, right? Very little fire at all three of these sites in the last 150 years. At Mount Rainier though, that's not out of character. You know, we haven't suppressed fire here to the point where we've missed a fire rotation, right? We're not really, 300 years beyond the last stand replacing fire. At Long Lake, it looks like the Little Ice Age came along and really kind of dampened the amount of fire activity that was going on. But after the Little Ice Age, that should have gone back up. We should have had that more frequent fire again. That didn't happen. And I feel very strongly that that's fire suppression because the forests around Long Lake are very crowded, are very kind of overgrown and unhealthy. Fish Lake, right? Very clearly you can see that we are missing the fire activity. Again, those very frequent, low severity ground clearing fires that were happening at this elevation, right? Let me show you one more here. Let me add in, this is Fish Lake you saw, Doheny Lake you saw, and here's now the full record from Long Lake down here. Again, look at about, the last 6,000 years is really when we get way more charcoal in these records. Get this kind of pattern of fire every 80 years across the landscape at Long Lake. And then again, clearly very, very different what's going on today, right? Last thing I'll show you here before I run out of time is this Eastern Cascades Fire History Synthesis. So this is something my most recent grad student who just graduated last year put together. All of the sites that we have so far now are here combined into this record, just like that curve I showed you for that 2015 paper. So standardized charcoal scores, essentially Z-scores. And what you see is that we start basically with low fire activity, and every time the line changes color, we're adding in another record. Not all of these records are the same age. The oldest one is 16,000 years old. The newest one is about 3,800 years old. But what you can clearly see is that especially over, well, I mean, even just since 13,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago, fire activity is just increasing in the Eastern Cascades. And a lot of this has to do with forest establishment that happens right about 7,000 years ago in the Eastern Cascades. So we're adding biomass, we're adding the amount of fuel that can be burned. But what should really stand, and this is not published yet, so this is the only thing that's not published yet. We're working on it. But what should really stand out is this big drop at the end, right? This big drop over the last couple hundred years and what's termed the fire deficit, right? That's where we find ourselves today. I know maybe it doesn't feel like a deficit, right? It doesn't feel like we're having a lack of fire. That's because we're kind of turning the corner on this fire deficit, and the forests are trying to catch up, essentially. They're overcrowded. Many of them are overcrowded. Again, I want to draw distinctions between the different kinds of forests that we have in the Eastern Cascades. High elevation, haven't really seen much change. It's middle elevation and low elevation where we're seeing our big issues. And so we're coming out of this fire deficit. We're going to have to burn our way essentially out of this fire deficit, whether that's prescribed burns or whether that's catastrophic wildfires happening. So last thing I'll say here, I just hit 30 minutes on the nose. I was trying to keep it to that. You know, it takes a lot to manage our fire landscapes here in the Pacific Northwest and all across the Western US. And that's not my job. You know, I'm not the land manager. I'm the person supplying essentially the data to the land managers, but I am co-chair of our graduate program who's training our land managers to go out there. And in fact, my grad student Grace is here today. So it's going to take a lot, right? It's going to take a lot of collaboration. It's going to take a lot of organizations, a lot of, you know, people working together, and a lot of voices. I want to very clearly say that, you know, that much of the fire that we see in these fire history records was human use of fire, especially at places like Fish Lake and Doheny Lake. And so those voices need to be represented as well. So I can say more if anybody has questions after we're all done, but there's my information and I'm happy to put that in the chat. Is there a chat? I don't know if there's a chat on this one, but.
Yeah, there's a chat.
Okay, great. I'm used to Zoom. So there we go.
Yes. Stick your info in the chat, and then we're going to turn it over to JD. And if folks want to put questions in the chat now, you can. We'll have time for Q&A at the end too. All right, JD, are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead and give me permission.
Okay, here we go. Megan, that was so great. Thank you so much.
Most definitely. If you can't tell, I love talking about fire.
Margaret, are we good? Can you guys see my PowerPoint?
It's perfect.
Perfect. And I really want to thank Megan for talking about, you know, fire ecology and where we're at. It helps me because I would generally have to talk about it, and that's definitely not my forte. And to really talk about my topic, you really have to have that background of you know, the historic of fire and what's currently happening. So I'm really stoked she was able to talk. And I guess once again, Margaret did a great job of introducing me, but I am, my name is JD Jones. I'm the Fisheries Program Manager and the Forest Burned Area Emergency Response Coordinator on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. And I love being able to be, you know, my main job is being working with fish, but I also am super appreciative of the Forest Service where I can branch out and work with fire. So today I'm really, I want to talk about fish interaction and the human reaction to wildfires. And I always kind of like a quick roadmap, just so you guys know where I'm going. And I'll talk quickly about fish and firefighter interactions. I just want to make sure you guys kind of, you know, get some insight if you haven't been around it or know much. And then I'll talk, you know, ecological short-term effects to fish and the Forest Service response, specifically the burned area emergency response. You know, how we get out and deal with some things. And then I want to talk a little bit about fire long-term effects to fish and landscape. So let's see. So, you know, when a wildfire is raging on, you know, animals, they can fly or hop or run to safety, but, you know, fish can't. You know, they're kind of isolated to a very small area. And of course, you know, during a fire, you know, you can bring all sorts of temperatures of, you know, the stream that will sometimes raise it to lethal points and kill fish. You know, it can dry streams, and that can be a pretty big threat to fish. But you know, even firefighting efforts are a threat, which people forget. And you know, that could be, you know, fire retardants. They're toxic. They can cause suffocation for fish. Water tenders, they can pump streams dry or to very low places, or even pump fish into them. Bulldozers can go right through our streams, and you know, they're trying to build a fire line. You know, we're trying to protect things, but you know, that can have a pretty big effect towards fish. And then you know, although people can't do much about direct effects that fire will have on the stream during wildfire, we can make an effort to reduce the direct or indirect effects that our fire attack can cause to fish or other natural resources. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, protecting the public and firefighters is always the top fire management priority of any fire team. And even like the protection of endangered species is trumped by ensuring human safety. So, but as long as firefighters are able to fight safely, there are tools to protect resources. And one important tool that folks may or may not know is that on the fire, we have a whole workforce. They're called resource advisors, or READs is what they are, and they help our fire operations make the best decisions to protect resources. Sorry. So they help the fire team avoid cultural important areas. If there's roadless areas where we don't really want any new roads to be built, they keep them out of there. If there's streams with threatened and endangered species, we try to point them out and make sure we're avoiding them as much as possible. READs make sure that we have the correct filters or screens on our pumps, so we're not pumping fish up. They make sure we have, I call them kind of pump diapers or something, where we have this kind of bowl or some sort of bag or some sort of tray for our pumps to sit on, so we're not getting oil into our creeks. You know, it's really this trying to limit our effect as much as possible. And then also what's important that folks don't often know is that we have a dedicated, like our forests dedicate a lot of time to updating our aerial fire retardant avoidance areas. And basically we, you know, where our streams are, where our lakes are, we create pretty good shape files and maps that we hand to our, you know, helicopter folks and or our airplanes to make sure we're trying to give them the best tool available to hopefully miss streams when they're dumping some of this toxic stuff. And then of course it's important to know that, you know, even as the fire starts, you know, getting contained, it's not burning so much. READs work with the fire team to do a lot of rehabilitation. So they fix roads, they try to fix dozer lines and hand lines, basically trying to, you know, limit erosion and effects. And although we make an effort to reduce, you know, effects during the fire, it is very time specific. And it's really what happens after the fire that will have the biggest effect. And, you know, kind of moving kind of past the you know, the fire, the active part, and into post-fire ecosystem, you know, I think it's important to do kind of a quick wildfire flood risk recap. And maybe it's just because I like looking at my little clouds going by, but you know, before the fire, when it rains, there was vegetation to slow down water entry, and as it falls, it comes to the ground. There's organic material, litter, duff, bark, all sorts of things that allow water to easily soak into the land. Then, of course, we have fire. The vegetation is gone. There's bare soil. There's no organic matter on the ground. The fires cause soils to maybe to start repelling water, and the soil is not absorbing water fast enough. This leads to overland flow. And of course, it rains and overland flow occurs, and it can lead to all sorts of large events. And, you know, all these, you know, big landslides that can cause all sorts of havoc to, you know, our fish, poor fish. And I really like pictures and just kind of going over all sorts of things that could happen. So, you know, here's a debris flow. You can kind of see it coming down. You know, lots of logs. You know, it's going to impact. It impacts our rec areas. It impacts our fish habitat. You know, and then here's another one. Sorry, keeping the buttons. Here's another where we have, you know, big kind of landslide coming down. It can affect our roads. It can affect water quality. And, you know, with all these types of things that can happen, that can be pretty big, and I got a little pop up. Sorry, guys. All these things that can happen. You know, one of the ways the Forest Service tries to, you know, protect things is going through our burned area emergency response. So, burned area emergency response what is it? And it's a program to identify imminent post-fire threats to human life and safety, property, and critical natural or critical resources. And we want to take immediate action to address whatever the risks are. Like the risks, like to the natural resources, could be, the fire causing all sorts of landslides that could block culverts and then cause any sort of threat that might happen to like an endangered or threatened species. The response to whatever the threat is, it needs to be immediate, needs to be minimal, preventative, and effective. And to add on to like really looking at this, we need to be able to look at a fire and what happened, and we need to have an evaluation and a proposal within 7 days of containment of the fire. So this is really important that we do it as soon as possible. And this is kind of a quick graph or a quick little picture of like, where does Bear fit in? It's not in the suppression part where the reeds go out and they build line and fix and help fix line, fix roads, try to reduce at least what the fire incident team caused to land. And then it's not long-term rehabilitation or restoration to streams. So it's really in that little time before where the fire is out and your first like imminent threat of a storm. So maybe it's just that winter, maybe you're in an area that has a lot more rain than areas. But it's really time sensitive. So then then there's a Bear team that's put together, and the Bear team can be put together. It can be all sorts of folks. It depends on what kind of resources on the ground. It could be geologists, soil scientists, wildlife biologists, fish biologists, engineers, and they could be from folks from the Forest Service, the BLM, WDFW, DNR. I've had many tribes participate on the team. So it's a big effort. Some of these fires are pretty big, and you want to get as many boots on the ground as you can. So now we're moving on to after the Bear team is formed. And we want to identify all the critical values in the area, like specifically in our case, like, are there endangered fish there? And then we want to identify the potential threats to the critical values. So, are there landslides that could come to get the fish? And then the probability of that occurring and the magnitude or the cost of the potential damages. So will a landslide wipe out all the population or just a few individuals? That kind of thought process. And then we use this little risk matrix, assessment matrix, to kind of help us determine, where are, is this a threat, and is the critical value, is there enough that could happen here that we're going to need to do something? So the team will look at like different ways that we could do something, and evaluate the cost and effectiveness, and if it can actually get done. And treatments need to be evaluated based on the ability to be implemented in a timely manner, the effectiveness in reducing the risk. Is it practical? Is it feasible? So maybe there's a wide variety of ways to try to fix a problem. And so the matrix above helps us find unacceptable risk, but how do you find like the probability of magnitude? Like what tools or what can we look at to help us better understand what the effects of the fire will have? So there are two main physical components to assess what a fire effects can potentially cause, and one is soil, and the second is water. We will discuss water shortly, but I just want to make sure we cover soil a bit, as what's on the ground is important, and the potential of how much like overland flow a fire area could have. It's important to know like how much stuff is on the ground, needles, has the soil become hydrophobic, as in like is water able to seep into the soil, or is it being repelled? And it's also important to know the fire intensity, that it does not always indicate like the fire affects the soil. So what we see like in the canopy doesn't necessarily mean total destruction happened on the ground or in the soil. And so to get the best idea of what happened, the Bear team has to go out and investigate. So, so the bear team goes around the burned area, looking at all the soil burn, and trying to assess like what the fire has done. There are 3 types of soil burn severity. There's low unburnt, moderate, or high. And finding high soil burn severity is the most important, because it's often locations where floods, debris flows, erosion, and like slow vegetative recovery occurs. These types of areas are like where high probability and the high magnitude threats to downstream values will occur. And so when the fires have large areas of high and moderate burn severity, it can mean pretty bad things. And you know, I threw a couple different pictures up here, kind of looking at what soil kind of looks like. Oftentimes when you have high burn severity, all the roots are consumed. The soil becomes hydrophobic, where you can like put drops of water on it and it won't soak in. It just sits there like a little blob, a little bubble. It's pretty neat. It's actually pretty cool to see. So, and I think it's important to note that even, you know, in our day where we have like much larger kind of mega fires, that they still burn in a mosaic, and not only vegetatively, but soil. Here's a fire on the Colville. You can kind of see just a wide variety of colors, with the dark black being some of the more high severe burns, and then all the way to places where it was unburnt, little islands all over the place. Like I said, I like showing different, you know, just lots of pictures. And this is the Big Hollow Fire, which is, you know, just on the Gifford Pinchot a couple years ago. You can see another mosaic. I didn't get to go on a helicopter flight on this one, so I didn't get as cool as a photo, but you can see, you know, the different mosaic of you know, high intensity, at least in the canopy. Another thing that's important to note is oftentimes we'll have fires that happen through old burns or where there are clear cuts. And whenever we have that vegetation or already had a place that was like burnt, it can easily have much higher burn severity. And then just another photo of kind of the mosaic of you know, a burn. You have all sorts of islands, places that get you know, for whatever reason, they just get missed. And even here's kind of a close-up like of a mosaic of a creek, and you can see there's some green trees, there's some black trees. You know, it kind of makes it a little more complex on what's going to happen on this creek. So let's see. So now, you know, with how many fires we're having and how large they are, and you know, trying to make it makes it a little difficult to see all parts of the fire. So luckily we have a satellite that's able to get reflectance, and it's taken it, and it gives us a really good idea of kind of where the bear team members should go look. It's important to still have field verification, as the satellite reflectance picks up all sorts of oddities, like often like a boulder or lava, rock scree type places. They often come out as like a high burn severity. So let's see. So after we get all our soil burn severity together, get everybody out, get all our data, we're able to really look, build a nice little map, and determine like places that have high and moderate burn severity. So kind of on this fire, we could really look at like the critical values would be a lot more higher risk in these areas that are red and yellow. This is the Big Hollow Fire again, and I threw it on a topo map because you can really start seeing like where places where you have high intensity, and you can start seeing where it's like a little steeper and such. And so the Big Hollow, like the Big Hollow Creek, is where the big red area is, and I always like zooming in on that so you can see, here's a drainage. It kind of not only vegetatively it got nuked, but the soils got nuked. So it's really an important place for us to look at critical values and maybe things that we could do to maybe save something downstream. And then I always like bringing up the Eagle Creek fire because that was an interesting fire with a lot of interesting values. We had lots of fish interaction, lots of people interaction. We had fish hatcheries, and we had pretty good burns in the Tanner Creek and Eagle Creek area, like pretty high severity just in general. And then now, like the second main kind of physical component to assess to see where fire effects beyond soil is water. And this is where, like we have a bunch of hydrologists on our team. They find pour points generally on the bottom of drainages where stream crossings are. And they want to make sure they're modeling like a storm or like a rain event that's kind of typically could happen on a year to year. And then they want to model that storm on a place that just lost all its vegetation. And the reason for that, we could start seeing how much water flow we're going to increase. And the reason we'd want to know that is if we had like a 4-foot culvert down at the bottom of that drainage that is, over the last few years has been able to handle the water discharge coming out of the drainage. Now all of a sudden we're going to have a whole lot more drainage, and can that culvert hold that water? And then of course, like also that water is going to pick up debris. So could it pick up debris as well? And luckily, we can also model debris flow hazard as well. And we use the hydro model, the soil burn severity and slope, and we can see what the increase in water discharge post-fire is expected. And then what kind of like floatable debris could be created. And this helps us know the likely debris flow, what could happen. And then we can start really, now that we've kind of have all these models, we can start making some decent determinations on the effects to fish habitat, fish populations, and water quality. So this is kind of where I get to jump in, and I get a lot more fun because I don't have to model everything all the, and we can really start looking at like what do we need to go look at? What's on the ground that could cause other issues? And so we would go to these high areas with possible debris flows, these high burn severity, and we'd want to look what else is on there. Are there undersized culverts? Are there like restricted stream banks caused by roads? Was there a lot of runoff? Were there places with unstable soil already? We also want to look at the history of the area. So was there extreme logging, grazing? Did they do splash damming? A lot of these type of things where you're getting the complexity out of the stream, they can be super cumulative on the effects, especially when you start adding these kind of more intense fires. And of course, it's always important to look at, species that with narrow habitat requirements and highly degraded and fragmented systems. The species are likely to be most vulnerable to fire and fire-related disturbances. So when we look at fish as a species, they're already limited to the water, and then their habitat has already been reduced by man-made structures, such as culverts, and degraded by an assortment of land uses, logging, grazing, pulling the logs out of the river, and then roads going right up them. And all this makes them very vulnerable to fire and fire disturbance. So if during our bear assessment, we can identify where threatened endangered species are, and we find that there's a high likelihood of debris flows, and if the species has been isolated or there's just degraded habitat, it's time to start thinking about what kind of action we can do. And like here's an example of a drainage on the right that's been nuked. There's a road that goes through at that where the drainage comes to the road. There's a culvert that's too small, and in that creek we have steelhead. So if we were to have some large rains come through and it clogs up this culvert, anything down below, we could have pretty large sediment impulse. And of course it could also destroy a lot of the habitat in the stream. So we'd probably want to recommend removing or replacing the culvert. So let's see. So we could recommend a plethora of things. We can replace culverts. We can put in log jams. We can fly in mulch on the hillside. We could protect all sorts of things to help from big detrimental rain events. Of course, we also need to think, take into account the species involved, and of course, in the Pacific Northwest, salmonid rule. And I don't really want to get a ton into all the ins and outs of salmon biology, but as given the opportunity, salmonids and other species that are like adapted to the disturbances will gravitate towards more complex environments rather than just simpler ones. And salmon are like amazingly adaptable creatures, and they're programmed to work hard for their survival. You just need to look at at their life cycle alone to appreciate the detriment, that they hatch in fresh water, they spend their young lives making their way to the ocean, where they feed and then compete for several years, and then before their biological clock all of a sudden tells them you need to return home and spawn. And then to do that, you gotta go hundreds of miles upstream, and you gotta fight the current, you gotta fight other fish, you gotta overcome now dams and waterfalls and bears and me fishing to reach the small section of stream where you started the cycle. And of course, it's important to also acknowledge that the salmon, once they reach maturity in all sorts of different, like between 2 and 8 years, and some can stay in the ocean for just a year or up to 8. And this can give them, an evolution advantage living in such a complex environment. So, if a fire did occur, fish, specifically salmon, are able to adapt. Maybe a detrimental fire comes through one year, they're out in the ocean during that year, they're out for another year, and that the streams start being able to heal themselves. And by the time the salmon comes back, he has a decent spot to live. So I think not only should we be looking at like salmonids, certain species and how they evolve, but we need to look at the response of the aquatic ecosystem. We have to look at all the different things on how sediment and nutrient and woody debris and all our macroinvertebrates, how they normally live, and then what happens when you have a pulse, have a wildfire, and all of a sudden you got a pulse of sediment and nutrient, and just kind of how does that connect, all the different dots, and kind of how Megan said, like, we get all these great things coming in, new nutrients coming into the system, which can, as you see different peaks for populations go, as more trees come in and litter, you get more production. And then also, not only salmon adapted to this complex environment, but so is the ecosystem, right? And fire is a disturbance that can reset time. It can add important components to the health, and complexity of habitat. It increases the in-stream wood, it increases sediment supply, nutrients, food. And so, it's just important to know that even in a giant landslide, maybe and adding all that sediment, maybe that's what was needed for that stream. Like, for instance, here's a little like giant kind of flow, giant dam, log jam that was created. This is a lot more complex habitat than there was before, and fish are going to be a lot more happy. So I kind of ran through lots of different things, but one of the main things I feel like I kind of run into is we put a lot of this post-fire management action, like we're going to go sit with this giant fire just came through. We need to do all these things. We need to fix everything, and we kind of have this reactive, like, oh, we just need to remove this culvert, and it'll save the day. But maybe a better thought would have been, putting the money and time and effort and trying to replace the culvert before it was a problem. And then, of course, funding is always a big question. We just got this huge disaster relief funding for many of the Oregon fires down below, and they prioritize human property and that type of things and recreation over fish and natural resources. So anyways, I didn't show very many pictures of fish, so I always like showing my favorite fish, which is steelhead and red band trout. So lots of pictures. And yeah, that's what I have to share.
Thanks, JD. Those
Yep.
those were beautiful fish pictures at the end.
Yes.
Those are really nice. So now's the time for question and answer. And there's someone out there named Ron who has a question. Ron, you might have to unmute yourself. And I don't know the person.
Oh, thank you. Megan, great talk. JD, great talk. I private messaged Megan. I guess what my biggest wonder, if you will, to find the balance between forest management practices and harvesting and fire, and how sediment from those events have impacted the streams, as JD was talking about, in culverts and things like that, to mitigate the landscape for fish. Thanks. So that's either JD question or a Megan question. You guys choose.
Megan, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah, Ron and I were chatting back and forth a little bit. And, one of the things, especially being over here in the Eastern Cascades, right? Logging is going to have to be part of the solution for our fire problem, right? We can't just burn our way out of this. There's no way people are going to accept that much fire on the landscape. So how do we, log and not ruin the things you're talking about, JD, right? How do we, do that responsibly? How do we make it part of the proactive instead of the reactive, right? Not just salvage logging when a fire happens, but, helping it on the front end, reducing the fuel.
Yeah, I would add, certainly using not only fire, but logging are the two tools we have to use to be able to meet any sort of, ecological benefit moving forward. If we don't use that, we'll continue to go back in time.
Sue Baker had maybe a related question. Sue, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Or it's in the chat if you want to look at it, Megan.
Let's see, one thing I noticed on the graphs for the last 100 years was not only the reduction of charcoal, but there was also no green. Well, the green is herbaceous charcoal, right? So there's no fire at all. It's not burning trees, but it's also not burning any of the understory stuff as well. Is that what you were referring to on the graphs? Where'd Sue go, did she? Oh,
she's here, but she's still muted. Sue, we can't hear her. We're glad you're here though, Sue.
Oh, she said she misunderstood, but yeah.
She's in the chat, got it, okay.
Yeah, it's still a good point, right? It's that, we've removed all fire. We've removed all the good fire, right? And now I guess I wanted to make this point more clear. I kind of forgot to say it clearly at the end, is that, fire is good, but it's the right kind of fire in the right kind of environment, right? It's the kind of fire that an environment is historically used to. It's that now we're getting these massive catastrophic fires where we used to have low severity ground clearing fires. And so it's not like we can just say, okay, let fire go back in. You got to let the right kind of fire go back in. And oftentimes that does mean coming in and logging first, thinning it, and prescribed burning it, and then doing that again, and then staying on top of it. And so it becomes this massive, massive undertaking, as JD knows, as the Forest Service, they know this, the DNR knows this. I'm not telling them anything they don't know or trying to, right? It's just that we can see that historical context. We are way far away from where we should be.
Thanks, that's good. Michael?
Can folks hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the presentations. They were awesome. And JD, I appreciated your last comment about, the fire relief in Oregon, and, the fact I've had a chance to see the Clackamas and North Santiam fires up close, and the intensity of fire just right down to the stream's edge is pretty mind-boggling. I was kind of curious what your sense is as far as, while there's a lot of spirited public debate and criticism about what's the right thing to do for, post-fire restoration, but in places like that where you've got all that infrastructure and, human, infrastructure as well, is there still a lot of debate among the kind of resource professionals about how do you do post-fire restoration when, like, the entire riparian zone is burned down to the water's edge? Just kind of curious about how the maybe different fire behavior in some of these fires might is being addressed, with in your efforts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, those fires did do pretty good damage. You know, I always think, you know, even with post-fire, many of these watersheds that were burnt were already in pretty big trouble as far as all the things that we already did. And so I think, and I think the Forest Service is trying to take steps where we're looking at kind of a bigger picture of like the whole sub watershed or a watershed. And you know, even though they're not prioritizing funding for some of these things right now, they were still allowed to put asks forward, you know. So you see places where they want to put a whole bunch of large trees in the creek, or a lot of plantings, a lot of riparian plantings. So I have a lot of hope, actually, especially with how, especially the Oregon forests are really building up their boots on the ground, and not just our Forest Service boots on the ground, but getting everyone else involved. They got a lot of contractors working, and so yeah, I think they're making a lot of decent decisions. But with every fire, it's going to take a long time to heal. If
Thank you.
Does that kind of get your answer to your question?
No, I appreciate it. It's going to be fascinating to watch, particularly with you know, having reservoirs that have starved systems for sediment, and like you said, all the other long-term decisions that, you know, created the forest conditions that we have, just to see how that comes back.
Yeah, and I would also say, you know, some of the things that have happened in those areas was, you know, some of the public, you know, kind of the political decisions that were made, you know, kind of like Megan just alluded to, like we stopped logging. And that was a big part of why we built these huge matchsticks. You know, it was ready to blow up.
Sobering. Are there other questions? I noticed that our friends and partners at the Cowiche Canyon Conservancy are also having a talk on fire. I don't have the date for that. It might be later in February or March. So if you really want to dig in, check out their website for that. We have the 2 more talks coming up in our winter speaker series. They're both on Tuesday nights in 2 weeks and in a month. So fish recovery and fish numbers, and then cottonwood forests and managed rivers and the impacts for fish. So really exciting topics to come. Thank you guys so much for, thank everyone for coming, and thank you JD and Megan, you were awesome speakers. And Megan, I'd love to take your class.
Please do come.
Yeah.
Thank you for arranging this. This was really fun.
This was fun. Yeah. Thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Yep.
Thanks for clapping.
Feel free to email any questions you have. I love chatting about this stuff. So
Thank you.
definitely. Nice to meet you, JD, and hopefully
nice to meet you.
let's chat more. Maybe I'll have you come to my class next time I teach my pyrogeography class. And
Yeah, that would be awesome.
yep, meet us out in the field. You can